I'm remembering that. I never ever believed that. You can have a whole class of kids down to the, and I'm like, I can't remember my, let's go again. That's my. Yes, I will welcome everybody from our master.
I had to learn from my husband how to throw off a teacher voice, because I'm not usually very loud. Don't do it. Thank you. All right, thank you. Okay, everyone, we're going to see about getting started. Hold that down so you can hear me better. I am Jamie Clemens. I am the director here at the Syracuse-Wawasee Historical Museum. We're very happy to work with Chautauqua to help bring the women's suffrage program to the community. Thank you all for wearing your mask. I will let you know that now that you are seated, you may take your mask off if you feel comfortable doing that. You just have to put it back on if you decide to get up. So I'll be up here operating everything. So I'm going to turn everything over to Beth, and she's going to introduce our speakers.
I am, and I'm not going to waste any time because it's going to be a fun afternoon. So, hi, welcome to Marsha Miller's presentation from Amanda to Zerelda, Hoosier suffragists who raised a ruckus. I think it's going to be great. As you can see, we have a suffragist with us and who has lots of information. And she comes from Indiana State University, where she's a research and education specialist at the library. She's also the Indiana chapter president for the American Association of University Women. She's on the Indiana Committee for Equality Day celebrations. So she comes as a great Centennial package. She's a librarian extraordinaire. So I will turn this over to her because she has a multimedia presentation I think is going to be really fun for us today. Welcome. welcome, Marsha.
It's the right of every woman to know what happened life, not to be a thing that culture are a true and loving life, to fill the soul with gladness and recall the world of Christ as she goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. As she goes marching on. It's her right to serve the nation in its every hour of need. Her right to sit in judgment on her country's faith and creed, and show the world her courage by some high heroic deed as she goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. As she goes marching on. It's her right to train the children in the home and in the school, to help in framing statutes and determine who shall rule, and like man to cast her ballot for a statesman or a fool as she goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. As she goes marching on. Thank you. I borrowed this prop. I did not bring that with me, but should bring that with. Should always have a sign. Lots of signs going on. I'm just glad to be here today. Glad to see you. Glad it's a beautiful September day. Don't be surprised if you have a couple of more opportunities to see me. So I am Marsha Miller I'm from Terre Haute, Indiana. I'm on the board of the League of Women Voters there. And in 2012, we started marching every year for Women's Equality Day. This year, strangely, we finished up virtually. It's very odd, but we pulled it off. And you can find that on the Facebook page for Women's March, TH for Terre Haute. I've been presenting something like this presentation you're getting today for a number of years at Indiana State University, because one of the entities that I've been working with for a very long time is women's studies, which became gender studies, which became part of multidisciplinary studies. And so when the opportunity came to apply to be part of the Speakers Bureau, it was just a perfect point in time for me, and I'm so thrilled when they were able to let me be one of the 11 folks who are part of that Speakers Bureau. Some people are continuing into 2021. I have done some virtual, I have done some live presentations, and I love them both, but I like the live ones more because it's something that should be presented to people who are physically in the room and appreciating this. In addition to the pre-show today, which if you saw all the way through the loop, it was all of the historical markers in Indiana having to do with suffrage, interspersed with some of my favorite photos from the national suffragist movement. And then I never come light, people who know me. So over time, I started collecting children's books having to do with suffrage. And that's what I have on display here for the most part today, because of course so many people don't know about suffrage until way later, if at all. So why not write books for children, right? So I have some wonderful examples here. You're more than welcome to take a look at them. And then the panels that you see were actually done by the immediate past president of the League of Women Voters. She loves to put panels together. We have photos from every march in a collage, but these are the more general historical ones. The famous march in 1913, if you don't know about that, you should, in Washington, D.C., where we kind of ruined President, using the term we, kind of ruined Woodrow Wilson's arrival into town. If you've seen Iron-Jawed Angels, you know about the March of 1913. If you haven't seen Iron-Jawed Angels, you need to see Iron-Jawed Angels. Some general things about moving from 1920 to 2020, and then a smaller panel over on the table where it is the Equal Suffrage Society of Indiana State Normal School 1913 from their yearbook. Those kinds of things that just sort of sit either forgotten or unknown would probably be in the yearbooks of any college or university that was allowing women in 1913. In our yearbook, they had over 200 members. There were faculty who had signed the petition for equal suffrage. They were mentioned frequently in the 1913 yearbook, a tiny bit in 1914, and then they just kind of disappeared out of that source. So one of the things that's important for us to do is keep in mind not only the 100 years since we got the vote, but also the 72 years it took us to get the vote, and now, what are we going to do with the vote going forward? So that's something to think about, because we want to catch the history that's going on now. We want people to be looking around in their attics or their grandmother's attics and look for things that their local museum, library, or historical society might be willing to put online. The yearbooks that we have for Indiana State are all online, so somebody can go and look through those and kind of find that group picture. So there's so much history being just rediscovered. There's so many people digging up new elements about the history of the suffrage movement, and I'm just really glad to be a small part of it. So while we're going to be talking primarily today, thank you, about who's your suffragist who raised a ruckus, not everybody raises a ruckus, but a lot of people were raising a ruckus for women's suffrage. I am going to start with a quote by Carrie Chapman Catt, who was president of the North American Women's Suffrage Association in 1920 when the final ratification took place so that all women in all states, theoretically, were able to get to vote. We know some groups of people continued to have problems for the next 2 decades, but technically that is where we come from. So she, of course, she was more polite than Alice Paul was, but she was after the same thing. And she, of course, gave many speeches, and she was there for the final battle in Tennessee when suffragists from Tennessee and anti-suffragists from Tennessee were literally in the hills and plains of Tennessee chasing down the legislators in a hot July and August day to get them to come back to the special legislative session, and all of the suffragists, anti-suffragists, legislators, men about town were all in the Hermitage Hotel. It was dry because the 18th Amendment had taken effect, except for a room on the 8th floor of the hotel, which became known as the Jack Daniels room. So she was there through it all, through thick or thin, and a lot of times in person. So one of the arguments about women not getting the vote along the way were that we just weren't prepared for what politics would do to us. We were just not in shape for it, we wouldn't understand it. So when you put that hat on and you listen to what she estimates that 72-year struggle contained, more than 50 referendums, 480 campaigns to get legislatures to submit suffrage amendments to voters, 47 campaigns to get constitutional conventions to write women's suffrage into state conventions, 277 campaigns to get state party conventions to include women's suffrage planks, 30 campaigns to get presidential party campaigns to include women's suffrage planks in party platforms, and 19 campaigns with 19 successive Congresses. I put to you that there were few people better prepared to play politics after 1920. And of course, some women did have various levels of voting privileges before that time. But I cannot imagine the energy of so many of these people who were at the forefront, not just the people who were nationally known, but also the people who were doing their part throughout the towns, villages, cities, districts of Indiana, caravans, taking petitions to literally to the state legislature and so on. So that's where we are today. All for these few little words. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. If the 19th Amendment had passed the first time before all of those things I just mentioned, it actually would have been the 16th Amendment. Come on, guys, let's get going here. And of course, over time, it became known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in honor of all of the work that she did. So when you move through the official 72-year campaign battle for the right for every woman to vote, there were a lot of arguments, pretty much all of which seem kind of silly today. At least I hope they do. But one of the things that was going on was that men had their sphere and women had their sphere. And of course, the woman's sphere was the home. And the men were business. Politics. And politics was nasty, dirty, and it would sully the woman, sully the pure woman, so that she would end up on the street with a placard looking a little the worse for wear. I assure you that if there were pro-suffrage songs, there were anti-suffrage songs, and major anti-suffrage speakers as well. They were very firm in their beliefs. And so some of the songs will say women's sphere, which is a very hard word to sing. But that's one of the things that I found was kind of interesting. So Indiana, sorry, I just think I'm missing a slide. So Indiana dates it from 69 years because of the first well, not a problem. Maybe I grabbed the wrong version. It's all there, don't worry about it. I'll be fine. You'll be fine. So in 1851 in Dublin, that was when the first, and actually the person who's been doing the real history of Indiana, she's pretty, Anita Morgan, who wrote the We Must Be Fearless book, someone who heard of that. I think she's fighting a pretty good battle that we were maybe the first state to do a convention outside of Seneca Falls. And the historical marker is on US 40, and you might have seen that going through. So now, of course, we're celebrating in many different ways. And so 72 years for the United States as a group for the federal amendment, 69 years in Indiana. And that was known as they founded the Indiana Women's Rights Association at that time. And then a few years later, as at the time, the two national organizations, the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was formed right around almost the same month as the North American Women's Suffrage Association. Kind of wonder about that. All of a sudden, in May of 1869, quick, join one of these groups. So it was coming along. In Indiana, of course, we had local and state organizations. And while there was steady energy put towards the suffrage movement, there were some times when people got flagged a little tiny bit. Kokomo actually claims after the 1880s, when the Indiana movement kind of slowed down a little bit, that in 1906, which is an interesting year because that's the year Susan B. Anthony died. So maybe the fact that since she was one of the best known, maybe that kind of started energizing some people in the state to say, wait, we've lost one of our major leaders in the movement. It's time to really pull back together. So you never really know what is going to make that happen. But now, this is one of the pictures that you'll see if you go to the Indiana Women's Suffrage Centennial, which is a wonderful site full of resources for children and adults, lots of history and so on. Please take some time to look through that and see what's there. So over time, as the League of Women Voters was doing its yearly march, we would always try to add something. We added living history badges, not unlike the yellow ones that you have today. We had lanyards, we had t-shirts, we had buttons, these are some of the people I want to talk about today from those living history badges. Again, if you go to the Facebook page of Women's March TH, you'll see a lot of the badges that I've actually put online if you're interested in following these more. This idea was from another member of the steering committee in terms of putting it together. And it was wonderful to be able to put this information together. I tried very hard for those people I chose for the living history badges to find birth and death dates, which is a few cases were hard, a photo, and it was wonderful when I was able to actually find a quotation, because the words of the suffragists are so important. We can talk about the history of them, but it's the actual words, and boy, did they say a lot of words. So a few people to get you going here today. And I know some of you have probably been reading the local newspapers, the other media coverage, gone to some of the other presentations. Folks here have done such a marvelous job of celebrating the suffrage movement. There are some places in the state that maybe could have done a little more, but that's okay. Any effort is appreciated, but you guys really had it down pat. So one of the things that happened in the early days of the suffrage movement, it was very heavily Quaker. And on this side, I have Celeste Jane Terrell Barnhill, who lived to see suffrage come in, and she was a Quaker born in Ohio. Now, Dublin, Indiana, is just across the line from Ohio, right? So when I started thinking about this, I had this image of a bunch of little Quakers from Ohio, suffragists kind of sneaking across the border one night into Indiana going, come on, it's time, let's go. So she was president of the Indianapolis Council of Women, Franchise League, Legislative Council of Indiana Women, which is one of the things I will talk about, which is truly unique to Indiana. But I love her quote, because I just read that, just that one summation by Carrie Chapman, of everything they're doing. Quaker women took the initiative in the suffrage movement. They were used to speaking in meetings and very adept at the work of organization. So that was just part of my early training, and it was not hard at all. I think some people might Now, how many of you have heard of Helen Gowden? Okay. She is, where did I meet her? She is one of she's probably the most interesting person. I use that in a weighted way. We'll come back to Helen because she is one of the people I want to focus on. Maybe I like her because she comes from Michigan, across the border. Whereas I came by way of Arkansas, so she came directly down. And like a lot of people was initially involved in the temperance movement, a lot of people were involved in abolition or temperance who then moved into, crossed the lines, moving into the suffrage movement. As you may know, Frederick Douglass was one of the males at Seneca Falls, and he and Susan B. Anthony had a very long friendship and relationship, both of them. So she came down to Lafayette, married a young lawyer, And she began a newspaper column, she wrote a newspaper, and she slowly moved into the suffrage movement. And as my card says, when Susan Anthony spoke in 1880, she was the opening speaker, and she crossed the stream. She was an important member of both the American women's suffrage and the national women's suffrage. And she was one of the people, the many people, who spoke either in front of the Indiana legislature, one or multiple times, or spoke to some part of the United States legislature. So she was actually president of one of the earlier suffrage entities in the state, the Indiana Equal Suffrage Association. And she went to Kansas multiple times. They asked her to come when Kansas was fighting for their suffrage battle. I said, interesting. I don't know if I would want to be her friend, but I would definitely not like to be on her bad side. And we will come back to that. She died unexpectedly in 1907. She was getting older in years, but she was still energetic, and she died in her sleep. Now, where's my Amanda? Here's my Amanda. Amanda Tizarelda. So Amanda didn't make it to see suffrage come, but she's called the mother of Indiana suffrage. She's the one who introduced what they called the Greensboro Resolution in 1851, which proposed the Indiana Women's Rights Convention, which then took place later that same year in 1851. And by 1857, she's in front of the state legislature. Now, some of the people did move either as strong suffragists in the state and then into the national, or did some sort of groundwork in the state and then moved on. We have several of those. One of them is Miss Garrett Hay, and I like to point her out for one very interesting reason among many. First of all, she did cross over into post-suffrage. She became very involved in New York. New York was upper state New York was a hotbed of suffrage. That's Carrie Chapman Chatt, that's Susan B. Anthony, that's Frederick Douglass. Anyway, so she was doing a lot in the New York area, but this was the interesting piece. Carrie Chapman Catt and she are buried side by side. And the quote is that, "Here lie two, united in friendship for 38 years through constant service to a great cause." Don't you want to know more about that friendship, that relationship, and all of the different things that they did? Because again, while we have certain famous names, it certainly was a team effort. Another, and in some areas, the best known suffragist to come out of Indiana is May Wright Sewell. She died July 22nd, 1920. Is close. Well, she is a very interesting Hoosier, even without suffrage. She was an educator, but she founded the Indianapolis Equal Suffrage Society and also a girls' classical school in the 1880s. But also in the 1880s, she moved on because, do you know the word shenanigans? Politics has a lot of shenanigans in it, but in 1883, there were some big shenanigans going on in the Indiana State Legislature, and she moved on to the national field. If you do have the book, You Must Be Fearless, that's a quote from May Wright Sewell. And in Washington, D.C., there is a Sewell-Belmont historic, National Historic Monument. Now it was called something else for a while. Ta-da! And so much for that. So, but here's my Z, my Zerelda. Again, another interesting person, even without the suffrage part. First of all, she was the wife of a governor. She was, and congressman. She was the stepmother of who? Lou Wallace, who was of, does anybody read Ben-Hur? I think it would probably be something you'd have to slog through, but that was important. She became his stepmother when he was at the age where he was old enough to run away from home and be cranky for a while, but then they had a very loving relationship. But supposedly Ben-Hur's mother is actually based on what's a relative here. So Major's temperance person coming over into suffrage, she too testifying at the United States Senate Judiciary Committee, of which there were multiple. And a quote from her, "It is not the woman question that brings us before you today. It is the human question. You have attempted to do an impossible thing, to represent the whole by one half. And because we are the other half, we ask you to recognize our rights as citizens of this republic." It was the old taxation without representation argument that sometimes went over well and sometimes did not. All right, so let's come back to Helen for a moment. When she married her attorney husband, they were both young, but he had horrible eyesight, so she read all of his legal documents to him and became well-versed in the law. And over time, she moved from being a staunch temperance person to a staunch suffrage person, back to prohibition as temperance became prohibition, and some other, what I'm going to call ill-fated ventures toward the end of her life, but I'm going to use the word quirky. She got a little quirky. There's a book over here, it's the only, oh, there it is. Where the Saints Have Trod. It was written in 1985 by a Lafayette journalist who obviously spent a lot of time with all of the microfilm newspapers, so it's very detailed, and this woman packs more energy into way more than one lifetime. So she was a very interesting person all of her life. She got more interesting than she got a little quirky. So one of the things, of course, we're focusing on is suffrage today. But just a few more things about her, and then look for that book in your public library or your university library. We did have a copy in the United States University Library, but then I realized I needed to own my own copy, so I got a copy on Amazon, the Amazon Market. So she married John Gover and helped him with his law practice for 30 years. She did a newspaper column in the Lafayette Daily Courier about, again, with temperance. And then she really fought battles, legal battles. So she, in 1882, she sued Western Union Telegraph Company. But the big one was in 1893, the one that really got some national attention. Her husband had a very close friend and partner, and some people wanted to take Helen down a peg, and they should have known better even then. So a bunch of citizens basically came one night to their home and had a little demonstration outside the home and published some really nasty, libelous cartoons. So she sued the police chief, who was one of the people in the crowd, and she won. She won $5,000, but we can't really be sure they ever actually paid her. But also at the same time, she's getting into the suffrage campaign. Again, she went out to Kansas. Kansas was trying to get women to have municipal suffrage at first, and then later for state suffrage. And then a few years passed, and she's on the lecture circuit. A lot of people don't really think about lecture circuits in the 1880s. So if this was the 1880s or 1870s or 1890s, I would be coming to you today because I was part of a lecture circuit. And so the people organizing it would have chosen the people they wanted to come to town for the lectures or for the Chautauqua or, whatever. And so some of these people were obviously speaking to suffragist groups, but they were also going into towns and speaking. And In 1887, Helen did 64 lectures in 5 weeks just in the Midwest. So they were orators. They were amazing folks. Well, so she was pretty well known in a lot of different circles. And in 1893, she ended up having to sue a U.S. congressman and a newspaper in Massachusetts for libel. So that's pretty much a big effort for a lot of people. But then in 1894, she decided to vote. She was not allowed to vote. So who did she sue? The election board. Okay, that's pretty good, right? So the case comes before the Tippecanoe County Bar in 1895. She wanted to represent herself in the suit, so she was admitted as the first female member of the Tippecanoe County Bar in the morning. In the afternoon, she delivered her 4-hour argument, Gauger v. Timberlake. And then, of course, that was published as a 66-page pamphlet called The Constitutional Rights of the Women of Indiana. She lost her case, by the way. She appealed it, lost the appeal. So you can find Gauger v. Morse, you can find Gauger v. Timberlake in the journals. And again, that's just a few of the things. I was so lucky. She and her husband built a new home fairly late in life. And in March, just before all things became not normal, I presented at a retirement community there in West Lafayette, and their home had become a series of mostly funeral homes, and I called the funeral home and I was able to go into the home. There's a plaque, and that's where her historical marker is, and they haven't really done too much to the home that she lived in, so it still felt very Victorian. Nice young funeral director taking me around, telling me a few things, and I'm about to leave, and he says, "Do you want to see the photos, Grandpa?" Yes, I do. So it was just, I really felt a nice touch to her. By then, I think that she'd gotten a little worn out. Sometimes it's interesting for people, if you're looking for pictures of Susan B. Anthony, there's the one you see with her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You see that one a lot, where they're up in years a little bit. But there's also some photos out there of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, very young, looking girl-like. And there are young pictures of Susan B. Anthony. But of course, in some cases, you only see that one photo, whatever that one photo happens to be. But again, I think this one looks like a very young, noble, purposeful woman, and this woman looks like she's just about had enough. I can see her going, if I have to sue one more person, I just don't know what I'm going to do. And what, of course, she would do is sue them. All right. A couple of local things. Again, Terre Haute, the Equal Suffrage Society. This is Ruth Marion Cox, who was a graduate of Indiana State Normal in '91. By 1913, she's an assistant professor of German language, one of the faculty who signed into the Equal Suffrage Society, but also early on, she was in the Indianapolis Suffrage Society, and then the Women's Franchise League, and some things changed names and some things came and went. And in 1915, she was a member of the Indianapolis Women's Franchise League, which had over 1,000 members. And again, that's really the only picture we have of her. It has been so interesting over the years to look for images having to do with women's suffrage. And one of the things that was used constantly were flyers. Some of them might be produced by the national organizations and then sent to the local organizations, like this one here, you can see is the Women's Franchise League of Indiana, but I'm just positive that it would have been reproduced throughout the states. You cannot read this. But you can find things like that. I have one more to show you. So these are very typical of the flyers that they were using. This one says, vote for women. People say, we say. The first one is, the majority of women don't want to vote. That's what people say. And we say, the majority never wants progress. I thought that was kind of in your face for a first thing on the flyer to say. Here. Like, come on. And down here, women are represented by men. And the question is, would men let women represent them at the polls? Kind of turning it. Does a man with women to represent have more than one vote? Or does he count his vote according to the majority vote of those he represents? No, because he's not representing everybody. So a lot of work went into these flyers. They were producing them all of the time. This is one other one. Why Indiana women should vote, with the big three: taxation, citizenship legislation, underneath the header, women should vote for the same reason men do. But quite a bit as under the legislation. I'll just read two to you. At present, about 3 million women are enjoying full suffrage in the world, and half as many municipal suffrage. According to the best authority, this everywhere proves to be a, quote, reform based on justice, counseled by wisdom, and justified by experience, unquote. And the next one says, and this is true, Indiana women are as intelligent, virtuous, and public-spirited as are the women of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Washington, and California, where women now vote for all offices elected by the people. So, yeah, come on. Give us a second. These are two of the earlier photos I found as I started looking for not just images like flyers, but also photos of Auburn over here, Fort Wayne over here. I love this because it's a mixed group of people with a nice Votes for Women poster. Unfortunately, I don't have any idea at this point who these people are and what they're doing, unfortunately. But I need to go back and see if anyone has actually figured that out. So just a couple more things about this People's Suffrage League and Indiana State Normal. They had an emblem. We actually used it in our March t-shirts. We made t-shirts for a few years, so that was nice. But one of the things I found interesting is I would tend to think in those days, and actually until today, a lot of the folks going to Indiana State are from Indiana. So why is she from Greenville, Oklahoma? So again, I tried to find some information about her. I could not find any. I'm going to assume she had an Indiana connection. But she was the president. So a couple more pictures of local folks. You've probably seen some of the articles that point out, unfortunately, African American women didn't get the same voting privileges overall as white women. We also have read stories recently that, well, there were statements that one could certainly imply and actually not imply were racist from people like Susan B. and Elizabeth Cady. We can blame it on the times, but there was also the strategy that they chose. And the strategy was in response, greater response to the women in the southern states. And there were parallel associations in Indiana as well as many other states for African American women. One of my colleagues on the Women's Equality Day steering committee is Dr. Crystal Reynolds, and she is a historian by nature, and she wrote her dissertation about African Americans, blacks at Indiana State. So she's been researching this, and this Bertha Coakley is one of the people in that Equal Suffrage Society yearbook So she was a member of the organization at the university. She was an education major. She lived in what was known as the black part of town, so it was a little bag type. And Dr. Reynolds is still trying to research and find out more about her. I had to include this one because this woman here, first of all, does she, at face value, does that person, is she a Helen Gouger? She looks pretty nice, grandmotherly, bakes cookies. She also lived on the street that I live on. There's a neighborhood in Terre Haute called Farrington Grove. It's a historic district, but it has, a lot of it's transitional in nature, but there are historic entities. So she crossed over the line into women's suffrage, lasted until 1951. Look at all this. President of the Terre Haute Franchise League, president, League of Women Voters, first woman to serve on a jury and foreman in Vigo County, first woman member of the school board, first person in the park board. So never make assumptions on that. And that was what happened with a lot of people. They were already active or became active. And in fact, some of the women's clubs were saying, would sometimes the areas where a lot of the anti-suffrage people would sort of congregate because clubs and associations were doing good works. They were doing things for their communities, but they didn't necessarily want to get into having the vote. And I think they were very, very conflicted on that. Now, someone a little more famous that Terre Haute lays claim to is, of course, Eugene Debs and his wife, Kate. Interesting quick trivia note, one of the major biographies of Debs, which was published some years ago, says that she really didn't support her husband in his socialist movement and everything. And one of my history colleagues at Indiana State University has proven beyond a shadow of doubt that she was very supportive of his everything. And I love, again, sort of that determined young woman over here, where maybe as people got older, you don't quite see the determination. And again, I like to see the people through time. So she might have been a little more stay at home, but she was certainly his support. And unfortunately, a more recent book about Debs is still quoting that lack of support just for him generally. But pertinent to us, they were both speaking out for women's suffrage, just like the Quakers looking at equality. Socialism looked at equality. And as early as the 1903, Debs was saying some things specific to suffrage in the London Saturday Review. Kate in 1910 had a column called The Right of Women, no valid argument against the right of women to vote in unequal terms with men. This one is very typical of Eugene oratory. We shall lift women from the mire where our fists have struck her, and set her by our side as our comrade and equal, and that will be learned in beauty. So again, that's the column that Kate did. And again, totally unrelated fact, if Kate Debs' family, that side of the family, didn't exist, we wouldn't have Busy Pop. Because one of her ancestors, actually one of her contemporary, a little older ancestors, invented the seltzer thing. Okay, so they were busy. All right, another person who's from Terre Haute for a lot of her life, and then moved into the national sphere, and when I say moved in a major way, is Ida Harper. Ida Harper does not yet have a historic marker, but she needs one. So she was a journalist, and she was in her formative years, her younger adult years in Terre Haute, and in the late 1870s, Eugene Debs brought Susan Anthony to town for one of her several appearances in Terre Haute. Some people were not happy that Susan was there, but others were. And it was at that time that she met Ida Houston, who continued on her path, went to Indianapolis for a while, but then she became close enough friends that she became Susan Anthony's official biographer. Before she was the biographer, she helped Susan work on, I should say, the history of women's suffrage. So in the 1880s, suffrage movement was going on since the 1840s. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan Anthony start writing the history of women's suffrage. Susan dies in 1906. By that time, Ida is writing volume 4 with Susan Anthony, finishes volume 4, and then writes another 2 volumes. So there's this 6-volume history of women's suffrage. It is not a series of books you want to read from cover to cover, because basically they opened up the trunk, they took out all the papers, and put it in. And so there are actually some people who have culled the most important parts from the history of women's suffrage. It is available at Google Books if you want to go poke around. And all of the different states are given credit as they are. So she moved out to New York to do the biography and work on this. Later she went to Stanford. Her daughter was going to Stanford for a while, so she went to college for a while with her daughter. But she also did a lot of what was called the Leslie Bureau of Suffrage Education. So a major player from Indiana that really needs more knowledge. Somebody needs to write this book. There have been some good articles written on her, but the other thing is, too, she was a journalist. She wrote. This is just one really tiny bibliography from just one publication called the North American Review. Women Cannot Vote, Why Women Cannot Vote in 1904, all the way through to 1919. So most of them are on topics that you would assume. But one that caught my eye was this one, The Life and Work of Clara Barton. What was Clara Barton? Nurse. Yeah, everybody knows Clara Barton was a nurse. She was also a suffragist. So that, again, is an element that we don't necessarily know about her. And so not surprisingly, this May 1912 was soon after Clara Barton died, and Ida wrote about that. So so many people are playing so many roles, with suffrage being central or side by side to everything else that they were doing. This is, again, just a little bit more about Harper. Actually, she divorced her husband. Didn't do that in those days. And went to Indianapolis from here. She was a managing editor of one of the Terre Haute papers. And again, The Life and Work of Susan B. Anthony, 4 volumes. Can't get all of Susan in 1 volume. And her dedication to woman for whose freedom Susan B. Anthony has given 50 years is no more ever. But Ida was well known enough that this was her New York Times obituary. How many people in the state of Indiana to this day get a New York Times obituary? This was 1932. She died. Author, journalist, lecturer. All right. So, we'll figure out how to do this here. So let me see. Yes. So this very first one. Okay. So strangely, it's also to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. So, are you ready? Me too. All right. Let's see. That's the one. They heard it in the shadows of that old New England bay. They heard it in the breezes of that cold December day. They said it with the echoes of Britannia far away, that the truth was marching on. 'cause last time it'll be good news ladies. Okay, back to where we were. There we go. Have any of you seen this wonderful, wonderful image indicating that votes for women started in the last? I just love this one. Sorry, that was me. What's that? Come back. Yeah.
So these words were widely known?
I'm sorry?
These words were widely known?
Yes.
Like a lot of words were.
Yes, I have around 40 pages of one songbook, and it seems like every other one was to the tune of Battle Hymn of the Republic. So there are collections of songs out there, and I believe I just saw a recent recollection of some of these. So a lot of them to Battle Hymn, patriotic songs from the Civil War, religious, anything that people would know, and again, it would sort of bring people together. So it would be in their paper program, and they would go with that, yeah. This is a piece of history related to, indirectly, the suffrage movement. And as far as we can tell, it really is unique. So, there were many women's organizations. There were many clubs, some of them suffrage, some of them not, some of them religious, some of them not. And in 1914, 8 organizations joined together to form what came to be called the Legislative Council of Women. Again, very unique, but wait, so we haven't. So again, their goal was not suffrage. Their goal was legislative issues of interest to all of these women that they wished to present to the state legislature in an organized way. 80,000 women in the state of Indiana were represented for a brief period of time by all of these entities coming together, including the Indiana Equal Suffrage League, including the Association of Collegiate Alumni, which in 1924 became the American Association of University Women, and so on, and so forth. And another woman from Terre Haute, Mrs. Stimson, was the chair of the steering committee, and there was other folks who were involved. So that sounds like a worthy development. This is the thing that just cracks me up. They said to Governor Ralston, "Hello, we're going to be talking to your state legislatures. Could we have a room in the State House?" And he said yes. So they gathered petitions, they organized, and back on January 16th, when we celebrated the state of Indiana ratifying at the State House, they put a plaque outside that room, which of course has been many other things. So the next time you're in the State House, you need to find out all of the people who look like they work there and see if they know where that room is, where that plaque is, and keep asking until you find it. So they worked for a number of years, and then they disbanded in 1917. And I think one of the reasons they disbanded in 1917, but I'm still looking into that, is this. The Master-McKinley Partial Suffrage Act. There were 3 acts in 1917 to help Indiana women get a vote. And the Master-McKinley Partial Suffrage Act passed. And I love this flyer. Your first vote for delegates to the Constitutional Convention, but you've got to register. Here's the time period. The act was passed in February of 1917. So then they had to get organized. And before the Supreme Court threw out the act, in Indianapolis alone, 30 to 40,000 women registered to vote. Oops, no, you can't vote anymore, sorry. How pissed off are you? So the entities like the Franchise League of Indiana, they of course sort of knocked their organizing up, in less than 2 years they had 300 leagues. Total, 200 of them were in those 2 years following 1972, all over the state. Think of all of the energy. If somebody, first of all, had just said, as they should have, the constitutional convention, 1789, everybody gets a vote. Think of where all of our energies could have been. If the state of Indiana in 1872 had said, okay, you can vote. Think of what all of these women could have been doing at that time. So I love this one. Now, voting came from the West, but there were a lot of years when all of those things that I listed for Carrie Chapel Camp were going on to no avail. So in 1869, when Wyoming becomes a territory, they give the vote to women. The book I Could Do That is a children's book about that time in Wyoming, about a real woman who helped work on getting the vote. And then when they became a state, they kept the women's vote. But then, not until 1893 did Colorado get the vote. So there's dates there, but I want to read to you what the color coding means. I've already said it a few times, or you already know it. It wasn't just you have the vote. Some of the early votes were just for certain types of votes. Women can vote for municipal elections, or school boards. And I think the argument there was that, well, that's close to their sphere. Okay. Who's keeping track of all of this? So the yellow states were full suffrage. The only polka dot state, which is Illinois, was municipal, presidential, partial, county, and state. The shaded states were taxation, bond, and school suffrage, and the blue states, of which at this time Indiana is still blue, no suffrage. Again, so you already had situations where people had to have multiple ballots. And I just find that very telling. So we're coming out of 1914 and into the final 6 years here with Montana and Florida. This is a photo from the Centennial page. Women in hats. You can't do suffrage without a hat. So finally, when the United States Congress passed the 19th Amendment and it went out to states, we had Governor Goodrich. His wife Cora was a suffragist. She and all of the other suffragists are going, okay, let's have a constitutional special meeting of the legislature. Now, this is a pop quiz. Why would they have to have a special session of the legislature? And they were not the only state.
Yeah, when voted, they're only came together every 3 years.
Our state legislature only, so before this, the current long, short, there was session, no session. Until when? The 1970s. Okay, all right. So, Governor Goodrich said, yes, we will have a special session. Yes, yes, stop bothering me. The word from the Anita Morgan book is basically he wanted to wait until it was a sure thing. I'm really not sure what that had to do with anything. So finally on December 31st, 1919, he said, I'm going to call a one-day special session of the state legislature. The only thing we're going to do is vote on ratifying. And when they did, the Senate voted 43-3. The House voted unanimously 93-0 to ratify. And also keep in mind that at that time, the Republicans were the more progressive party and the Democrats were the more conservative party. So they had to work together in that. So there were 300 pro-suffrage women who were there for that vote. The people who voted against it in the Senate, Haggerty from South Bend, who was a Democrat, McRae from Indianapolis, who was a Republican, and Klein from Huntington, who was a Republican, and he was in favor of suffrage in principle, but he was opposed to the way it was being put through. And then there were 3 senators who were not present. I'm like, well, what were you doing? Why weren't you there? And so here we have the ubiquitous governor surrounded by women in hat, signing off. That's that's the day after, it's January 17th. But I love this, a women plunge into education of new voters. I have one handout over here on the table that I would love for you to take. Yeah, if you want to. So, the ratification process is going on. And from 1919 into 1920. And Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan all ratified on the same day, June 10th, 1919. What I haven't been able to track down yet is who was really first in terms of the actual moment in time, because they're all claiming to have been first. Well, so we were the 26th state to ratify, and strangely, Wyoming being so forward thinking, they were the 27th. They weren't among the first 2. So, February, the ratification process is still going on. They still need, until February 12th, they basically, after February 12th, and I'm going to tell you why I'm talking about February 12th. 1, 2, 3, 4. They needed 5 more states after February 12th. On February 14th, the NAWSA, the North American Women's Suffrage Association, had its annual meeting, but Carrie Chapman Pat and her folks, it wasn't just the final meeting of NAWSA, it was the first meeting of the League of Women Voters at the same time before the final ratification. They were so positive that it was going to happen. I love this. So that's the actual program announcement on one side, found that online, and then that's the first group of people. Maud there was very much in the subject. One of her major lieutenants, who then became the League of Women Voters, because they knew it was coming and women needed to be educated in how to vote. They thought the League of Women Voters would probably be organized for about 6 months, and then they'd be done. We're not done. We're not done by anything electric reform. So of course we're celebrating not only the 100 years of suffrage, we're also celebrating the 100 years of the League of Women Voters. In an article I was creating for, we have a monthly publication called Terracotta Living. It's sponsored by the Tribune Star. It's free around town, and they're letting me put an article about the women's suffrage movement in August, September, October, and November. I'm trying to talk them into December. But two things, one of which is Carrie Chapman Kent got to vote in 1918 because New York could vote by 1918, and she had the Spanish influenza and was recovering, but got out of bed to go and vote. The other thing is the state of Indiana election board said, okay, we think that there's probably going to be 350,000 women in the state, and we need to figure out how to handle all that additional number of people and how much it's going to cost. President Wilson was against suffrage until he was for suffrage, kind of the same thing with the governor. I just can't imagine those nights at home with his lovely wife Cora, and when you're going to call the session. Right? So he says to the joint session, you can call together a special session today for what will become of the historic meetings. And there is little doubt as to how the General Assembly stands upon this question. You have already shown your sympathy with the suffrage movement by giving to the women of Indiana the largest degree of suffrage possible under our Constitution. And there were still some things floating around in the state legislature before the final ratification came. By your presence today, you display a deep appreciation of this inherent righteousness of the cause, which I believe since about 2 o'clock last Tuesday. Okay, you are a politician. So here's our governor signing, surrounded by the women in hats. Here's Tennessee governor signing the final ratification, surrounded by women in hats. Very, very similar pictures there. This is also one of my favorite images. The Women's Hour has stuff. And again, if you're a reader and you haven't, if you're more fascinated than ever before about how we got it, a book called The Woman's Hour. Wonderful book, just about that final push in Tennessee. And you all know, do you not, that vote was ratified with one vote. And it was a change vote. Because 24-year-old Harry Byrne got a note from his mother. It's a 7-page note. If you hear about this, it makes it sound like she wrote a little note that says, please vote for suffrage. But she wrote a very folksy letter. She was in a small town. Her name was Febb, F-E-B-B. She was a small town woman, but she was a college graduate. She was a farmer. She was a teacher. And she read several newspapers every day, every week, whenever they were available. And she was keeping an eye on things. Harry was going to vote against it because he thought his county wanted him to vote against it. And then he got this note of his mother. And interspersed with other things were several statements that very clearly had him vote. And when they were going around, and he said, aye, a few more votes happened and people went, wait, what? What did he? They did not turn feather him either, and he went on to do some interesting things in life. And his grandnephew has just written a book about his whole biography there. So here we are, 26 states, 2 women currently serving in the House. Took us 69 years to get that vote in Indiana. And in 1932, the first Indiana woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. So we have to celebrate with one more song. Keep going. Keep going. Go. Keep going. Wait, back up. There we go. Okay. We're happy. 1, 2, 3, here's a note. Good news, ladies. Good news, ladies. Good news, ladies. We're going to let you go. Merrily we'll go along, go along, go along. Merrily we'll go along, down the pole with you. Sweet So, IndianaSuffrage100.org, many events continuing to go on through this entire year. This is just their event calendar. And again, this is just, they keep adding things to this site all of the time. And of course, there are a number of entities, Indiana Humanities, Indiana State Library, the Centennial Commission itself. As I said, the League of Women Voters, we did our virtual campaign this year, and there's our Facebook page again, Women's Day March TH, if you want to go look at some of our living history badges, and also if you want to see our virtual presentation we did about the 100th anniversary. These are my thanks because, of course, I'm standing on the shoulders of many people, including my Dean, Robert B. Perman, who's very supportive of my going around and doing all of this. It's great. I mentioned Gender Studies, Women's Studies at ISU, the Speakers Bureau sponsored by the Centennial and coordinated through Indiana Humanities, League of Women Voters of Vigo County. One of the past presidents, Bianca Gamble, came up with the idea of looking at the number of people who were not voting and then going into a Women's Equality Day celebration. Carolyn Collicott, who's our immediate past president and was a member of that for many years. And again, she's the one who put these together along with many others. Dr. Crystal Reynolds, who did research on some of our local people, came up with the idea for the living history badges and so on. And Katie Kennedy, who did this year's badges. And again, the members of the Women's Equality Day Steering Committee for the last 8 years. So as I said, if you do have a chance to get out and go spot some historical markers, you're very close to Lafayette. So you can go there. This is the one in Dublin. This is at the Sewell Belmont National Historic Monument. Now, this is one of those original banners for the Silent Sentinels were doing back in 1917, 1918. It's a wonderful place to visit. This is the book that came out in March of this year, We Must Be Fearless. Anita Morgan at IUPUI. Anita Morgan, what did I say? Anyway, she's also been all over the state talking virtually and in person. This was a great play that was brought to us at the Phoenix Theater in the spring. You'll notice it stopped on March 22nd, except it stopped before then. But it's all about, it's just a two-person play, Susan Anthony and other judges. It was really good. And sometimes, they bring those plays back, so if you do have an opportunity, that would be good one. Some things coming on. So I mentioned The Woman's Hour as a book about Tennessee. The author of that, Elaine Weiss, just published, I just got this about 2 weeks ago, Adapted for Young Readers. So that's good. And then the major book written about the African American experience was published in 1998. And while there have been other publications, especially journal articles since then, this one here, Vanguard, which is coming out later this month, is the first full-length book, again dealing with the African American experience, the subheading, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. So keep your eye out for that. I've got my pre-ordered at Amazon. That is Martha S. Jones. Again, this was part of our Centennial, and you can find us there, lots of pictures of the years. And that brings us back closer. So thank you very much. Yes, I have any questions.
So, how do you overlay the war, World War I, over the final passage? What impact did the war have, one way or the other, when it gets elected in 1920?
To talk about that, I have to talk about the Civil War. The Civil War, basically, the women who were involved in that, involved in the effort at the time, were more or less asked to step back because it was a civil war. And let's focus our energies. And we promised to return after the war. Those women who remember that that did not happen when the Second World War came, there were a lot of people who were personally concerned about keeping the movement going. Now, by that time, we had Nassau and we had Elizabeth Paul's Congressional Union, the kind of, I'm going to say militant branch, but it's not really militant, but it was more, we need to work on the Washington the National Amendment. And a lot of people in Nassau were still of the belief that they wanted to do it state by state. And so there was a lot of conflict just about that and a lot of overview. But it was primarily the Congressional Union based in Washington to lobby Washington that when the war came, they said it didn't help us at all. And so we're going to keep doing what we do. And then we start with the Silent Sentinels movement, and that is when things really started to happen, because now there were women silently standing in front of the White House every single day, and they started in January of 1917, and they stood, and they came from all over. Sometimes they had trouble getting home to people, but they came from all over, and they were standing there, and so people were passing by, and what are these women doing? So they actually were protesting before we declared war, and then we declared war, and they were still protesting. And one of the things I saw recently that came out of the National Women's Suffrage site up in New York was a woman who portrayed Alice Paul for an hour. She was great. She's on YouTube. And she was talking about her conversation with us as Alice Paul was essentially saying, we knew that this was not going to work well with a lot of people, but when we started being attacked, we didn't let up, and then we started getting even more coverage, and in some ways it just all kind of came together. So then, of course, President Wilson has, again, he's still not really for suffrage, and he's also dealing with the war, and then moving into the influenza, and then moving into the past the war, and his League of Nations, and his stroke, and everything coming together. So I think they did what they felt they needed to do, and meanwhile, Carrie Chapman Catt and the National, the North American suffrage, they're doing it too, working their way, and working in Washington, and working in states, and it was just really one of those amazing moments. In fact, this book here that says 1919, the year that changed America, it wasn't quite 2020. There were no giant murderous South American hornets or fire tornadoes, but it was the Red Summer. Prohibition was in effect. There were huge labor strikes, women's suffrage, and the Red Scare. It was a messy, messy year. So I think it moved things along. Yes.
How do you account for that stunning map where all the western half of the U.S. has passed the amendment and all the eastern half has not done that?
Well, actually, it's not so much the amendment as which the states that were giving the vote to the women, state by state, and again.
Well, how do you account for that? I'm just curious.
Kind of a more, in some cases, they needed the votes. They needed more representation
in the actual United States, and I believe that so they counted it so they would have more votes.
The electoral college was playing a big part of it. That smaller, that vote the map that had down at the end of it, the electoral college, that was an additional factor of that. But yeah, it is interesting to see that and to wonder. And then of course we have the southern states which were kind of doing a lot of it, kind of doing their own thing. In fact, It's sort of funny that Tennessee, which is kind of a southern state. Another question?
I'd like to just thank Syracuse-Wawasee for putting on this event. And I'm Marsha Miller, I'm co-president of the Syracuse-Wawasee Garden Club, and you're looking at a beautiful tribute that has been up all summer to women's voting in the big bed over here in Lakeside Garden in the colors of purple,
nice.
yellow, and white. And that is why we're planting it. So in case you hadn't realized that, we'd like you to beware.
Martha also writes the cruising column in the Mail Journal.
And part of the way, also for Western.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Please take a little bit of time to look at the display, the children's books, especially if you have children, or no children, or talk to children. Something about children. They're all very well. So there's a few that are not for children, but I can't stop collecting them now. I can't wait to see what else comes out. Okay, thank you again.
Before we go, one more thing, please. Two things, okay. One is, would you please quickly fill out this blue sheet in the series of things on your chair so that we know what brought you, what was this, how did you find out about us, what brought you to this event? Really